There was a priest here who lived in the 4th and 3rd century BC named Manetho, who was one of the foremost historians for ancient Egypt.
All right, let's see it.
And in his writings, Manetho tells us that the Pharaoh of the Exodus was someone named Amenhotep.
This is flatly false. According to Manetho, the Pharaoh of his own account of the Exodus was someone named Amenhotep, whom some scholars identify with Akhenaten. And Akhenaten was previously known as Amenhotep IV. So if this Amenhotep is to be identified historically with Akhenaten, then we can identify this pharaoh as Amenhotep IV. However, there's a problem with that, because there is an Amenhotep mentioned by Manetho, and this is an advisor to the pharaoh Amenhotep. And many scholars think this Amenhotep was Amenhotep the son of Hapu, a famous priest and advisor to the pharaoh. Now, if this is Amenhotep the son of Hapu, he was the advisor to Amenhotep the third, the father of Amenhotep the fourth. And so we have two characters who are associated with each other in Manetho, who in Egyptian history are associated with two different pharaohs. Manetho does not identify any pharaoh of the Exodus as Amenhotep. It is our attempt to situate the story within Egyptian history that must identify them either as Amenhotep III or as Amenhotep IV. Whichever way we go, we are rejecting other parts of the story, though, which is not historical and which also does not line up with the story as told in the book of Exodus. According to Manetho, Moses was a Heliopolis priest named Osarseph, and when the Egyptians tried to drive out tens of thousands of lepers, they joined with Osarseph and rebelled and fought back against Egypt and created a bunch of anti-Egyptian laws, and then the Egyptians drove them out, and they scurried away to Jerusalem and then got help to try to fight back against the Egyptians. So it's an entirely different story, and the only reason we have this story from Manetho is because it is quoted at length and described by Josephus in Against Apion. Oh, also, Manetho is where we get the idea that the expulsion of the Hyksos can be identified with the Exodus.
Is there a pharaoh named Amenhotep that is reigning during the biblical date 1446 BC? Amenhotep I reigned from 1546 to 1526. His reign is too early. Amenhotep III reigned too late, from 1414 to 1377 BC. In between them, Amenhotep II reigned from 1450 to 1423. And so the biblical date of 1446 BC for the Exodus falls within the reign of Amenhotep II. The Amenhotep that Manetho is writing about must be Amenhotep II, because the dates of his reign are in sync with the biblical date of the Exodus.
But there are several problems with this. First, Manetho never mentions Amenhotep as the name of a pharaoh, only Amenhotep, who may be Akhenaten. And if Amenhotep is Akhenaten, then they are Amenhotep the fourth. Manetho does mention an Amenhotep as an advisor. If this advisor is to be identified with the historical Amenhotep son of Hapu, they were an advisor to Amenhotep the third, the pharaoh. Finally, again, Manetho's story has nothing to do with the biblical description of the story of the Exodus, and Manetho's story is not historical at all.
There's additional information from other verses in the Bible that can also be used to further test Amenhotep II. For example, in Exodus, it talks about the Pharaoh that reigns before the Exodus Pharaoh, and he is often referred to as the Pharaoh of the oppression. In the book of Exodus, we are told this: Pharaoh tried to kill Moses, but Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in Midian. During that long period, the king of Egypt died, before the Lord had said to Moses in Midian, "Go back to Egypt." In the New Testament, in Acts chapter 7, Stephen is retelling how Moses fled to Midian. But then after 40 years had passed, he returned to Egypt. We can test this then with Amenhotep II. Did the predecessor of Amenhotep II reign for more than 40 years? Well, his predecessor was his father, Thutmose III. And Thutmose III had a reign of 54 years. He's the only pharaoh in the 18th dynasty that had a reign for more than 40 years. So Amenhotep II passes this test.
So this attempt to take this statement about 40 years from the text of Acts 7 and overlay it on the text of Exodus and suggest that it provides more details and allows us to better situate this story historically is problematic for two main reasons. The first is that it presupposes univocality. It presupposes that whatever is stated in Acts 7 must agree with whatever is stated in the story of the Exodus. But there's a bigger problem than that. It is selectively presupposing univocality, because in several places Acts 7 directly contradicts the stories in Genesis and Exodus. And in those places, this creator rejects what Acts 7 says in favor of what is stated in Genesis and Exodus. For instance, according to Acts 7, it was not 430 years that the Israelites were in Egypt. That's what Exodus says, and that is critical to the establishment of this 1446 date. Acts 7 explicitly says that the Israelites were in Egypt for exactly 400 years. This creator is rejecting that part of Acts 7. According to Acts 7, Abraham had not yet settled in Haran when God visited him and gave him his commission, quoting Genesis 12. According to Genesis 11 and 12, God did not visit Abraham and give him his commission, the very same commission quoted in Acts 7, until he was already in Haran. According to Acts 7, Abraham did not leave Haran until after his father Terah died. According to Genesis 11 and 12, Abraham left Haran 60 years before his father Terah died. It says Terah was 70 when Abraham was born. It says Abraham left Haran at 75. That means Terah must have been 145 years old when Abraham left Haran. But Genesis 12 explicitly says that Terah was 205 years old when he died. So he did not die until 60 years after Abraham left Haran. So we have a number of ways that Acts 7 directly and explicitly contradicts the story as told in Genesis and Exodus. And this creator is ignoring those, but is going to take this statement about 40 years and is going to insist that that must agree with what's going on in Exodus.
Exodus 11:5 says of the 10th plague that every firstborn son in Egypt will die, including the firstborn son of Pharaoh, who sits on the throne. If Amenhotep II is the Exodus Pharaoh, then his firstborn son should have died in the 10th plague. And so the successor of Amenhotep II is his son, Thutmose IV, who is not his firstborn son. His firstborn son died mysteriously, we know from the Egyptian records.
I can find no mention in any Egyptian records of Amenhotep II's firstborn son having died mysteriously. What we find are indications that the succession of Thutmose IV was questioned. There's an inscription where Thutmose IV talks about being out hunting and falling asleep in the shadow of the Sphinx, and Ra-Horakhti visiting him and telling him that if the sand is cleared away from around the Sphinx, that he would be the one who would become king, and that immediately happens and he becomes king, which many historians interpret as an attempt to legitimize an illegitimate succession. In other words, someone was in line before him. There are certainly indications that Amenhotep II had other children, probably had children older than Thutmose IV. I can find no mention of any of them having died mysteriously.
This is the mummy of Amenhotep II, and the evidence is clear that he was the Pharaoh of the Exodus.
This apologetic argument is riddled with factual errors and logical fallacies.